You're listening to Aged Care Uncovered, shining a spotlight onto the Australian aged care sector, giving our older Australians and their families insight and a voice. Today's episode is sponsored by Aged Care Ready, assisting elderly clients and their families navigate the aged care sector. Now here's your host, Naomi Anderson.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Aged Care Uncovered. I am your host, Naomi Anderson. Today we are recording remotely. Well, is it remotely? No, it's not remotely. It's remotely for me. I'm in Sydney today, and I am joined by the wonderful Assyat David from the Aged Care Steps. Assyat is a co-founder and director of Aged Care Steps, the leading business supporting professionals to give advice on aged care and other related matters. Aged Care Steps focuses on supporting advisors to build and implement aged care advice efficiently and accurately. She has over 30 years of experience in the financial services industry. Prior to establishing Aged Care Steps, she was Executive General Manager, Financial Services at Trust Company, a listed trustee company, where she was responsible for financial planning, estates and trusts, estate planning, philanthropy, personal injury and funds management. Welcome, Assyat.
Thank you for the invitation.
So we are actually located in Sydney today. We're recording off-site, so that's why I get to sit across the table from Assyat. Let's start with, who is Aged Care Steps and what do you do?
Okay, so Aged Care Steps is a private company. We've been going for just over 10 years, and the whole aim of the company is to enable advisors to be able to provide aged care advice to their clients. Aged care advice is a specialist area. It requires specialist knowledge, specialist tools, and so we provide all of those things to advisors.
Yeah. So you're essentially the go-to in the training and resources and things like that.
That's right. Right.
That's amazing. And so what led you to specialise in aged care specifically?
So we recognise that aged care is an area that's becoming increasingly complex for a lot of individuals, that it's an area where the costs are increasing. A lot of people are finding it really difficult to navigate the aged care system, which causes a lot of family conflicts and the like. So what we're really aiming at doing, in essence, is to be able to support clients and their families make informed aged care decisions. Mm-hmm. And the best way of doing that was to try and do that through financial advisors, where they've got access to hundreds of clients themselves. So it's a case of, if we can support them to give that kind of support to their clients, then the number of clients who have got more confidence in dealing with aged care increases.
Yeah, and I think it's really important that service is available, because like you and I were talking about before, it's not a cookie cutter system.
No.
It's so tailored and so individualized to each and every person.
That's correct.
And it's not something that you can just organize or do yourself on a whim. You need that advice because you've built your whole life and you've got these assets that you've spent your whole life working towards, and you don't want to make a mistake, especially in the financial arena.
That's exactly right, and it is very different because it's certainly complex, but what a lot of people also don't understand is that there's a repercussion effect. Mm-hmm. So if someone makes a decision, particularly around their house, which is the core thing that we talk about when it comes to aged care, then if they sell their house because they think that's their only option, then that has implications for their Centrelink entitlement, it's got implications for their aged care fees, and they may not necessarily understand what the ramifications are when they're making that initial decision. Mm-hmm. So it's really important to get advice and understand what the personal situation is before they go ahead and make those kind of calls, because if that isn't the right decision, then how do you unsell your house? Mm. You can't.
Yeah, exactly. So going back to the services that you provide and the financial planners that work with you, what's involved in becoming an aged care specialist?
So the first thing is the advisor has to be a registered advisor on the Financial Advisor Register, which is an ASIC register. So they have to operate under a license and the like. So then aged care becomes a specialist area for them that they then need to get additional education and skills and knowledge to be able to then give that kind of support. So the first thing is they definitely have to be a financial advisor to give financial advice. So there are some out there that aren't financial advisors, so you just have to be careful about that. And then what they do is they attend our course. Our course is built around providing them with all the technical knowledge so that they can understand what strategies to model for different clients, understand how the fees and the aged care system works, and then a lot of it's built around helping them work through an advice process that we've developed internally, which is a 9-step advice process that they then work through. So there is a series of components, I guess, with the accreditation training. There's pre-reading modules which they need to read, understand, and do an assessment on, and then there are workshops where we work through scenarios, case studies, work through the different strategies, and then there is a test at the end of all of that, an assignment and a test for them to get the accreditation.
So it really is a next step up, I guess, from their bachelor qualification for their financial planning, isn't it?
It's a little bit different. So with financial advisors, it's just like, I guess, going to see a GP in a way. So a GP may have knowledge around a whole range of different things, just like a financial advisor may have knowledge around superannuation and investments and insurance and the like. But when it comes to specialist areas like aged care, the regulations require that they have specific competence in that area, which is acquiring the skills, knowledge and experience before they can start to give advice. And aged care is considered one of those specialist areas. So similar to a GP, the GP may talk broadly about your health, but when it comes to something specific, such as in relation to your heart or whatever, they might pass you on to a specialist, or they themselves might decide to actually do additional work and study in order to gain that qualification to become a specialist.
Yeah, okay. And I guess with everything that's happened in the last few years, it's pretty safe to say that the financial landscape is changing a lot. How often do you think that changes?
The financial, there's different components to that. The financial landscape itself changes quite a bit, and that's built around a lot of the regulations and the legislation that affects financial advisors, and there's been a lot of it in the last few years. One of the major things that has affected financial advisors in the last few years has been FASIA, which is now called the Code of Ethics, which is legislative obligation around certain standards that advisors have to meet when they give when they give financial advice generally, and that's really changed the way that they charge their clients. It's affected the way that they perhaps position their services, and it's actually made a lot of changes which are all built around looking after the best interest of the client and making sure that the client is the one who benefits from the advice that's being provided.
Yeah, so more like an advocate rather than, I guess, before. How was it like before that came about? Because there was a lot more commission-based fees, wasn't there?
Yeah, so some of the things that were ruled out were things like, yes, definitely commissions, and so the fee structure is more built around making sure that it's not a conflicted fee structure in any way. The other thing too is a lot of the incentives where advisors may have had incentives to recommend certain products over another because of who they were owned by. A lot of that has also been removed, but one of the core components of the Code of Ethics is the best interest duty, which has always been around in legislation in the Corporations Act, but it's now been strengthened even further with the Code of Ethics. Yeah. And it essentially says that an advisor needs to ensure that the advice they give, the information that they give, is in the best interest of clients.
Yeah. I think that's super important, and we see that in our own business as well at Aged Care Ready. Some competitors charge commissions to the facilities that they refer clients to, and that's all well and good, but I do feel that at some point our industry, specifically placement consultancy, is going to be governed by something similar, which is why we have chosen to be fee for service and not take any commissions from those types of referral partners. And in that way, we can demonstrate that our advice is in the best interest of the client.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Why do you think it's so important for clients facing aged care to get advice from an accredited aged care advisor?
So aged care advice, as you can appreciate, is a specialised area. A lot of the legislation that affects aged care is very specific, and so advisors really need to ensure that they do have that knowledge and the skills about understanding aged care. But not only knowing what the rules are and how to calculate fees, it's actually more than that. It's more around looking at a client situation and helping them navigate where they're heading, what decisions they need to make, taking into account the family considerations, estate planning considerations, tax, cash flows. There's quite a number of different variables and issues that an advisor needs to consider when they're giving aged care advice to clients. And advisors need to ensure that they've got that competence, as the legislation says, they've got the competence in that area. And particularly if they're well experienced, they can see what are some of the traps that clients may fall into, and so they're better positioned to be able to guide clients and their families to be able to navigate the aged care system, ensure that they don't fall into some of the traps that we talked about earlier, and that they think about the different options that are available to them, and they come up with an outcome that they're comfortable with, that's based on their personal circumstances and what works best for them and their family.
I think the whole overarching theme of what both our businesses do is that it always comes back to the client.
Yes.
What's in their best interest? What are their personal circumstances? And everything's so tailored to what they do, or what they are about and who they are. I was going to ask you another question. I've totally lost my train of thought.
But look, I guess that's absolutely right. And I think one of the key messages behind all of that is, like you said, there's no cookie cutter approach to aged care. Everyone comes into aged care from a different perspective. They've all got different needs. Their situation is all very different. And so the outcome that best suits them is going to be varied across all of them. And so out of all of that comes a lot of misconceptions around aged care, which people really need to ensure that they don't fall into the trap of believing them. So just because their neighbour had a certain outcome from aged care and they had to finance it through certain ways, doesn't mean that the same thing applies to them.
Yeah, and everybody's so different.
That's right.
I think, kind of going off on a little bit of tangent there as well, is that it's really important that if you're going to get this financial advice, that you're getting it from somebody who's not only just competent, but who actually does this day in, day out, not just sometimes.
That's right, yes.
Because, like we mentioned before, the financial landscape is changing so rapidly on a daily basis, and if you're an advisor or looking at an advisor who doesn't do that on the daily, then potentially you could be making some mistakes along the way.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. Speaking of families, looking at getting some aged care advice, this is a question that we get asked quite often, and that's, when do you start that conversation? So my question to you is, at what stage should someone seek out aged care advice? When should they start thinking about aged care?
So there's two components to that. The first one is, when should they start thinking about aged care? And the second part is, when should they start to seek advice? And the reason why I say that is because we should all be thinking about aged care. So if you consider that the money that we're contributing towards super, it's built around helping us in our retirement years. But what exactly are those retirement years going to comprise? And if you've got enough money in super, then that opens up opportunities. As we all know, the more money you've got, the more options you've got in terms of the way that you live your life. So that's a roundabout way of really saying that people all the way from age 40 onwards should really start to think about aged care, but the way that they think about it may vary. So if someone is, say, 40 to 50 years old, the things that they may consider is ensuring that they've got enough investments going into their super to give them the adequacy of savings in retirement in order to tackle the frailty years, which is, I think, an important component. But the other major thing is they may be either the power of attorney or the representative of their family members, their mum and dad, who may need to consider aged care. And so ensuring that they are aware of the aged care situation and that they have the aged care conversation with their parents is also really important. Because unfortunately what we find is in most circumstances, people ignore thinking about aged care or talking about aged care until the crisis event happens.
Yeah.
And by that stage, there's less that you can really do. You're overwhelmed by a lot of emotion at the time. Now we've coined the phrase, there's the 3 G's of aged care, which are the 3 emotions that often drive aged care decisions, which are grief, guilt, and greed. And that's not a great way to be making major decisions about things like your home and the house and your assets and estate planning implications and all those kinds of things. So it's really important that someone, even at the age of 40, starts thinking about their own situation and their adequacy of savings. They think about planning ahead if they for their parents and other family members that they may be responsible for, who may need aged care support at that time. And then as we move further, pre-retirees really need to think about incorporating aged care considerations around things like their cash flows. How much income are they really going to need in retirement? So they may spend a lot more in the early years when they're having a lot of fun and doing all the great things we look forward to in retirement. But as their health starts to change, then they move into those frailty years, then the level of income that they need at that point in time is probably also going to be increasing, because that's when they need additional income for the health needs, perhaps even things like paying for accommodation or paying for their proportion of, say, even if they get a home care package, modifications to the home so they can stay in the home for longer. All those different things cost money, and all of that needs to be taken into account. So it's really important to start the conversations as early as possible.
I totally agree. And like you said before, often families don't want to broach that subject because mum or dad or grandparent doesn't want to even consider that, because to them that has never been an option. They never want to go into care, and they're adamant that that's never going to happen. However, what they are doing by enabling that is not involving that person in those decisions, and then a catalyst occurs and those decisions, or a lot of them, are actually taken away from them, and then you're left with a very limited amount of options on what you can actually do.
That's exactly right. I tend to kind of argue in a different perspective for those kind of arguments. The first thing is, if someone wants to maintain control and independence, also control over what happens to them, then having those conversations early on is really important.
Absolutely.
So pre-planning ahead, because as you said, if it gets to a point where there's a crisis situation and they're no longer have got the ability or the capacity to make decisions on their behalf, they're passing that on to someone else who may not even know what their preferences are, and therefore make decisions that aren't what they would do, or what decisions they would make themselves. So having control means making sure that others who may be involved in the decision know what it is that you want and how things work. The second thing too is understanding that aged care is not just about moving into a residential care facility. There are a lot more options around aged care now. Home care is obviously the preferred place that people want to age in place, and a lot of the government reforms are built around trying to support clients and stay at home as long as they possibly can by releasing more and more home care packages. So there is aged care incorporates getting support to stay at home. It may incorporate things like moving into retirement villages or over 50s parks, and
service departments.
Yep, all those different things. And interestingly, there's a lot of innovation in the aged care sector, which a lot of people may not actually recognise. And that also means that there are a range of different types of accommodation models that are being provided. Some are like 5-star hotels. Of course, you need to have the money to move into those, so that goes back to the adequacy of saving conversation we had earlier. But being aware of all the different options, not having this misconception that aged care means you're going to be forced to go into an aged care facility against your will, is just something that I think people need to reconsider, because that is not necessarily the case.
Absolutely. And even, I think it's really important to outline that even if a catalyst does occur and you're at that stage where you need to make a decision, then leverage the use of respite. Pump the brakes a little bit. Let's just take our time to make a logical, switched on decision rather than something that's made with a lot of emotion behind it. And like you said, there are other options.
Yes.
So leverage that respite where you can so that you can explore all these other options.
Mm-hmm. Yes. One of the things that people don't necessarily also sometimes understand is that even if they move into a facility, they do have 28 days before they make a decision about the funding aspect. I think a lot of people may feel pressured, and like you said, pumping the brakes a little bit is important to sit back and just think about what's important for them and what their options are and what's in their best interest.
Should we talk about the federal budget? What are your thoughts on the money that's being targeted towards aged care?
The main component of the aged care was actually in last year's budget. There wasn't a lot in this year's budget, but aged care was a big component in last year's budget, and a lot of that came from the Royal Commission into Aged Care, where there were a range of different recommendations. And the government then announced its 5-year plan around aged care. And it also announced that it will be pumping something like another $18.8 billion over the next 5 years. And that's on top of the $21.5 billion per year that they already spend on aged care. So it's a huge component of the government spending, or significant component. And the reforms that the government was talking about spanned everything from home care to residential care through to the wages and the like that for the people actually working in home care and residential care, etc. So it is a major reform agenda that's been put on the table. Where it's not surprising that we didn't get too many changes in this year's budget because we've got the elections coming up. But we do think that after the elections have been sorted, there'll start to be more and more changes being announced around aged care because it's necessary.
Well, we are an ageing population.
Yes, indeed.
And I think especially after COVID, it's put a lot of strain on the sector as well.
It has. I think COVID has also highlighted the importance of having a frailty plan in place, because we've noticed that if older people are relying on their children or somebody else to be involved, to be able to come and visit them and help them out where it's needed, the pandemic has shown that sometimes that's not something that can be carried through, and so a lot of people felt that they were at home for a lot longer on their own, and therefore they started to explore what are their options around getting support beyond perhaps their children or their partner, and thinking about what if a pandemic like this continued on, how are they going to fare going forward? And so it's actually increased the interest and the demand for seeking aged care solutions.
Yeah, absolutely. Is there anything else that you wanted to talk about or add?
I think the other thing to kind of incorporate with a lot of what we're talking about is there's a lot of, as you said, a lot of pressures in relation to what's happening in the aged care system. The government is already paying a lot towards aged care. A lot of aged care facilities actually making operating losses. About 55% of them make operating losses.
Wow. Okay.
So one of the things that the messages we're trying to also push out is that planning ahead for your frailty years is really important. Whether it's done in conjunction with an accredited aged care advisor, or whether it's just having the initial conversation with family is really important. And the reason why we say that is because in our view, there's going to be more and more of a push towards a consumer pays type system within aged care. So basically, the government's paying already a lot. They already cover 96% of care costs. The facilities can't really afford to take on additional costs because they're already making operating losses. And so there'll always be a safety net for the ones that don't have funds to access aged care. But for the ones who do, we think that over time there's going to be more and more pressure for them to actually contribute more towards aged care. And that means that they really need to start to think about planning ahead a lot more for aged care, take into account their cash flows, not waiting for the crisis to happen, having those active conversations with their family, raising it with their aged care advisor or with their advisor generally around what aged care plans they've got in place, and being a little bit more proactive around it, because that's the best way that they can, as I said, maintain that control over all the different stages in retirement that they are going to be going through. And if clients do want to look for an accredited aged care advisor, they can find that on our website, which is Aged Care Steps. The website is www.agedcaresteps.com.au, and there is a section there that says Find an Advisor, and that will list all the accredited aged care advisors who are supported by us, and it covers advisors all around Australia.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
For those of you who would like to follow us on our socials, we have a Facebook page, Aged Care Ready, as well as on LinkedIn, and we also have a community support group as well on Facebook called Aging Parent Support Group. And of course, you can find Assyat and her team at www.agedcaresteps.com.au. Until next time, thank you.
Thanks for listening to Aged Care Uncovered. If you enjoyed today's episode, head on over to your favourite podcast streaming app and give it 5 stars. If you have any questions about today's episode or about aged care in general, please contact us.